Did the COVID-19 plandemic increase homicide rates? It has been asserted by various Democrats, that der plandemic is the reason homicide rates have been skyrocketing, primarily in Democrat-run cities that are diverse, full of fatherless children, full of food stamp usage, and full of working-age people taking an extended break from the labor force. If they can finger the Wuhan Chinese virus plandemic on why fatherless children are slaughtering fatherless children in places like Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, Los Angeles, then by golly, they can shift the blame from hashtag Black Lives Matter, the defund the police movement, and the Democrat Party. Let's look at some data, and I'll have a link to all this. And when I post this on Rumble, I'll post this entire spiel in the description on Rumble. Let's look at some data that I've already covered, and any sources I have not illuminated before will be added as well. Let's look at some state-level data focusing on the so-called non-lockdown states, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, Arkansas, Nebraska, versus the so-called lockdowns, that's the identifier I use for them, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., Rhode Island. I will add some other entities as well. I will look at homicide rates for 2018 and 2019 collectively, and then compare the increase-decrease for 2020. I'd rather look at several years at a time because one bad year can skew the data, but it is what it is, and some of the Democrats are claiming der plandemic is turning the U.S. population into frothing at the mouth barbarians. From 2018 to 2020, U.S. murder/non-negligent manslaughter rate 5.533 per 100,000. U.S. homicide rate 2018 and 2019 5.05 per 100,000. U.S. homicide rate 2020 6.5 per 100,000, a 28.72% increase relative to 2018-2019. Then we get down to the lockdowns. The homicide rate in the non-lockdowns, those are the states, Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Utah, Wyoming, Nebraska, Arkansas, their homicide rate was 5.066 per 100,000, a 53.84% increase relative to 2018 to 2019. I should note, Arkansas seriously skews this for the rest of them, but since they are one of the non-lockdowns, they have to be included. So the non-lockdowns had a homicide rate in 2018-2019 of 3.293, and in 2020 it went up to 5.066, which is still lower than the national average. And what did surprise me a little bit, the lockdowns, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Massachusetts, D.C., Rhode Island, their homicide rate in 2020 was 4.005, a 29.66% increase relative to 2018-2019. However, if you took Washington, D.C. out of the equation, the increase would not be so great because Washington, D.C. skews it up for everybody in that group. And their homicide rate, the lockdowns in 2018 and 2019 was 3.089 per 100,000. So they're not really the problem. I'm not going to cover all the following states in depth, but if you look at the spike in homicide in Illinois, and I did cover this later, I said I would wager outside East St. Louis and Chicago you are relatively safe in the land of Lincoln. You'll find out that total. If you look at the spike in homicide in Illinois, your eyes will jolt forth out of your head. Illinois was already one of the worst. Iowa remains well below the national average, but had a massive spike in 2020. Des Moines and Davenport disproportionately contributed to that, as their homicide rates are way beyond the Iowa average. You'll get that data too. Indiana had a murder, non-negligent manslaughter rate, and then that's what when I say criminal homicide, I also mean that, just so you know. Criminal homicide is different from negligent manslaughter and justifiable homicide. Indiana had a murder rate above the national average 2018-2020 and had a spike in the latter year as well. Much of that contribution can be directed at Gary and Indianapolis. And I talked about that so much I just decided to do it in part 2 of this, so you'll get that data. Wisconsin saw a massive spike in 2020, and I know this will surprise you, but Milwaukee was the culprit in much of that. Kansas saw their homicide rate in 2020 decrease relative to the 2018-2019 base period, as did New Hampshire. Lily-White, Maine saw statistically no change, and the same story for Hawaii and Nevada as well. Idaho saw an increase of only 10%, which is much lower than the national average, and their rate was very low before. And the gap between Idaho and the national average got larger. You will see a lot of states such as Iowa, South Dakota, Utah, Washington, Nebraska, to name a few, that had their very low criminal homicide rates in the base period be subjected to massive increases in 2020, yet their rate is still below the national average by a long shot. Keep that in mind. You will see that a lot of the problem cities like Milwaukee, Chicago, East St. Louis, etc., getting even worse during the plandemic. And they were well above the average, and it's just a wreck. And the gap between them and the average is getting larger. I hate to belabor the point, but those who are willingly ignorant need to be reminded of this on a regular basis. So if you see somebody who is one failed synapse away from being a walking vegetable, like Jen Psaki or Plugs Biden, if you see them assert that the plandemic is why criminal homicide rates are spiking and/or criminal homicide is going up everywhere, then you now know that they are full of you-know-what. And then I mentioned, if you've read my extensive essays on violent crime, you will notice that I always use multiple sources. And some states and municipalities are better at others at publishing UCR reports. So if you'll go through that data, you'll see sometimes I'll have statewide data, like state police data, FBI data, and local data if a local PD has good data on it. And some of them do. Many times a 2020 report for a state or city, and this is why you'll see some gaps between the FBI and state or city data. A 2020 report for a state or a city would amend the 29 total, and that may or may not increase the gulf between that data and the FBI. Example, the Arkansas Crime Information Center lists 232 murders in 2019, and the FBI says 242. But that is an estimation because not all of the agencies were reporting. The South Dakota Attorney General lists 16 cases of murder and non-negligent manslaughter, and the FBI says 17 for 2019. The difference is not usually large, but I felt you needed to see that and elucidate that for you as I try to turn over as many stones as possible, and kind of a case of CYA. If you know what that means, I'm not going to say it, but I also have all my data when I cover this for the FBI when I look at state data. And then the FBI has a new hub for this, so you'll have to go in there and access a different thing. I've elucidated in there what you have to do, so I've made it easy for you. And then, of course, I also have a link to where I compared the lockdowns and non-lockdowns on their responses to COVID using multiple sources and came to the conclusion that the non-lockdowns, they were evil and didn't do much to combat COVID, not according to the lamestream media, but yet their death rates were much lower. So, yeah. Now let's get to the meat of this. Did the COVID-19 plandemic increase homicide rates? Part 2. Let's delve into some more data just to hammer this point home into the thick skulls of marginally employed Democrats whose only enduring talent is copying rants off of Wikipedia and spamming memes. Wisconsin, homicide rate in 2018 and 2019 was roughly 3.759. There's not much of a difference between the Wisconsin Department of Justice and the FBI data. So it's their homicide rate, Wisconsin, in 2018 through 2020. I averaged all these 3 years just to, so one bad year wouldn't skew it. 3.759, that's very low. Milwaukee homicide rate for the same time frame was 21.996. Homicide rate in Wisconsin outside of Milwaukee for 2018 to 2020 was only 1.724 per 100,000. So if you've got a Democrats talking about Wisconsin, their rate is very low. It's lower than the national average. Their big problem city is, guess what? Milwaukee. And Milwaukee is, guess what? Run by Democrats. And if you look at the demographics of Milwaukee, you'll see why the homicide rate is so high. The spike in homicide in Wisconsin was mostly the Democrat enclave of Milwaukee. Criminal homicide is not increasing everywhere. So don't let them feed you that line of BS. What about Iowa? Iowa's homicide rate 2018 to 2020 was 2.368 per 100,000. Much lower than the national average. Davenport and Des Moines homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 6.837 per 100,000. Keep in mind, those two cities have roughly 10% of Iowa's population. 2018 to 2020 homicide rate for Iowa outside of Des Moines and Davenport, 1.871 per 100,000. Again, homicide is not increasing everywhere. It is mainly cities run by Democrats that are diverse. How about Minnesota? 2018 to 2020 homicide rate in Minnesota, 2.435 for 2.435 per 100,000, very low. Minnesota is a safe place overall. However, criminal homicide rate for the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul from 2018 to 2020 was 10.984 per 100,000. Criminal homicide rate in Minnesota outside of the Twin Cities for 2018 to 2020 was 1.152 per 100,000. Again, homicide is not increasing everywhere. It is mainly cities run by Democrats that have catered to the Black Lives Matter sociopaths, cities that have woke public schools, lots of folks on food stamps, lots of fatherless children, and they are usually diverse. The facts are not racist. The streets are full of transients, looters, and carjackers, but at least we're woke and diverse. How about Illinois? 2018 to 2020 homicide rate in Illinois, 7.5 per 100,000, well above the national average. East, St. Louis, and Chicago homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 23.391 per 100,000. Illinois homicide rate outside of Chicago and East St. Louis, 2018 to 2020, 3.105 per 100,000. Have we seen this movie before? So, as I've said many times, this is the first time I've really looked it up. I suspected it. I mean, I could see it from the data doing a back-of-the-envelope calculation. But I always suspected outside of those two entities, you are safe in Illinois. And you are. How about Indiana? 2018 to 2020 homicide rate for Indiana, 6.531 per 100,000, well above the national average. Gary in Indianapolis, 2018 to 2020 homicide rate, 23.967 per 100,000. Indiana criminal homicide rate outside of Gary in Indianapolis, 2018 through 2020, 3.679 per 100,000. Oh, snap. What about Ohio? 2018 to 2020 criminal homicide rate for Ohio, 5.463 per 100,000, right around the national average. Dayton, Cincinnati, and Cleveland criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 31.513 per 100,000. Criminal homicide rate in Ohio outside of Cleveland, Dayton, and Cincinnati for 2018 to 2020, 3.494 per 100,000. What about Michigan? 2018 to 2020 criminal homicide rate. There's two figures here because they differed a lot. The Michigan State Police and the FBI. You can read about that if you want. I'll just read off the FBI total, but I have them both up there for you to peruse. Michigan, 2018 to 2020 criminal homicide rate, 6.19 per 100,000. Criminal homicide rate in Detroit, Flint, and Pontiac, 2018 to 2020, 43.138 per 100,000. Criminal homicide, who they vote for the last couple presidential elections? And who do they send to the State House every year? I wonder what party. Criminal homicide rate in Michigan outside of Detroit, Flint, and Pontiac, 3.029 per 100,000. That's well below the national average. So guess what? The problems in Michigan can be attributed to three cities that are declining. You know why Rashida Tlaib gets voted in with, 80-90% of the vote? Because Detroit is a dump. Do you see a trend yet, folks? What about Virginia? 2018 to 2020 criminal homicide rate in Virginia, 5.221 per 100,000. What about Richmond, Roanoke, Norfolk, Petersburg, Newport News, Hampton, and Portsmouth? What do you think their homicide rate was for 2018 to 2020? 19.647. Remember, the U.S. rate was 5.533. Well over 3 times the average. Homicide rate in Virginia outside of Richmond, Roanoke, Norfolk, Danville, Newport News, Petersburg, Hampton, and Portsmouth. Guess what? 3.189 per 100,000. Have you seen this movie before? What about Georgia? Criminal homicide rate in Georgia, 2018 to 2020, 7.030 per 100,000. That's high. Criminal homicide rate for Atlanta, Richmond County, Savannah, Bibb County, and Dougherty County, 21.081 per 100,000. I wonder who they voted for. I wonder who they send to the State House. Criminal homicide rate in Georgia outside of Atlanta, Richmond County, Savannah, Bibb County, and Dougherty County from 2018 to 2020, 5.438 per 100,000. That's lower than the national average. How about North Carolina? Criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020 there was 6.745. I have two figures there. I use the state data too. I'll just read off the FBI. If you want to read the other one, see the link. North Carolina, criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 6.745 per 100,000. How about the criminal homicide rate in Fayetteville, Durham, and Greensboro? It was 13.955 per 100,000. Who'd they vote for? Criminal homicide rate in North Carolina outside of Fayetteville, Durham, and Greensboro, 6.16 per 100,000. That's still pretty high. North Carolina has some issues. But you can see those three cities pulling it up. They go above and beyond. In fact, they're twice as high, more than twice as high, the rest of the state. How about Louisiana? Criminal homicide rate, eye-popping, staggering 12.945. Now, I've had a lot of Democrats assert to me, oh, Louisiana got a high homicide rate, so and they vote Republican. Remember, prior to Obamacare, who controlled their state house for decades and decades? I just need to mention that. Who do you think? They've had their share of Democrat governors. It's been a high homicide rate state for a long time. But anyways, Louisiana, criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 12.945 per 100,000. That is extremely high. How about Shreveport, Baton Rouge, and Nolens? Criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020 was 36.221. Now, what do you think the criminal homicide rate in Louisiana outside of Shreveport, Baton Rouge, and Nolens is? Still very high, 8.151 per 100,000. Louisiana has a lot of issues. How about Alabama? Criminal homicide rate in Alabama, 2018 to 2020, 8.180 per 100,000. Montgomery City and Birmingham criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 36.414 per 100,000. Criminal homicide rate in Alabama outside of Montgomery City and Birmingham, 5.685 per 100,000. Just a skosh above the national average. How about Mississippi? There's a state that was run by Democrats for decades and decades and decades and decades until Obamacare came around, and now Republicans rule. If you know your history, I'm going to whisper like that senile guy, Joe Biden. Whisper at you. That means something. Criminal homicide rate in Mississippi, 2018 to 2020, 9.166 per 100,000. That's very high. Jackson, Mississippi criminal homicide rate, a staggering stratospheric 63.252 per 100,000. Homicide rate in Mississippi outside of Jackson is still a pretty high 6.183 per 100,000. So you can see how Jackson, Mississippi is the huge problem there. They have other problems, but they are the biggest one. How about Arkansas? Criminal homicide rate in Arkansas 2018 to 2020, 8.614. I have two figures for that too. I use state data. I'll just read off the FBI. If you want to see the state data, go see it yourself. Criminal homicide rate in Arkansas 2018 to 2020, 8.614 per 100,000. That's pretty high. Criminal homicide rate for North Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and Little Rock 2018 to 2020, 24.931 per 100,000. Criminal homicide rate in Arkansas outside of North Little Rock, Pine Bluff, and Little Rock, 6.751 per 100,000. Still pretty high. But you can see which cities pull it up the most. How about Missouri? Criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020. Again, I have two figures for that. They don't differ much, but I'll read off the FBI. Missouri criminal homicide rate 2018 to 2020, 10.304 per 100,000. How about St. Louis City and Kansas City, Missouri? Their criminal homicide rate for those years was 45.995. Criminal homicide rate in Missouri outside of those two cities, 4.923 per 100,000. Much lower than a little bit, well, not much lower, but lower than the national average. So you can see the massive spikes in homicide in Missouri were not Republican-run cities. Have you seen this movie before? I could do this all day, folks, and I've got a link to my part 3 on that, where I go through all these cities that I did 3 years ago, and I added a few. Pay special attention to the data I gleaned from state reports concerning homicide victims and homicide offenders by race. In Arkansas, for example, and Georgia too, just to name a few, it skews towards blacks. Young black men killing young black men. The facts aren't racist. So the next time you run into some dumbass asserting white militia members and white supremacists are threatening the black community, you can give them some of these stats and watch their tiny brain pans implode. The biggest threat to young black men in places like Arkansas, Philly, Atlanta, St. Louis, Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and on and on and on and on, aren't white militia members roving through the streets. It is not the KKK. It is not headhunting law enforcement officers / cops. The biggest threat to young black men in America are other young black men, and most of the time the perpetrator had no father, has a drug problem, or he's dealing, or both, a gang affiliation, and a criminal record a mile long. You might remember my data from Philly, even they had several years of this, good data. Most of the homicide victims in a couple years there had 4 more arrests, so it's gang on gang. And again, if someone asserts that homicide rates are increasing everywhere, black cities, white cities, red cities, blue cities, Republican cities, and Democrat states, Democrat cities and Republican states, Republican cities and Republican states, etc., dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, you can call BS on that because it is not true. Enjoy, and if you find it worthy, pass it on. The facts are not racist.